The intersection of endurance sport, health, fitness, and life. Challenging conventional ideas and empowering people with the science of self-propelled motion. This is the Endurance Experience Podcast, hosted by Tony Rich.
This is already the 11th episode of the Endurance Experience. Periodically, I'll glance at the viewership stats, and we've amassed a pretty big following thus far. And not only in the States, but also globally. And so I'll see periodically, Mexico. We got a pretty big following in Mexico for some reason. Also, on the map, I see big jumps in the Netherlands, Japan, and we also have a pretty big viewership base in France. And also Australia is frequently on the map. So to everybody out there globally that is following the Endurance Experience, thanks. And it looks like we're catching on with some of the ideas that we have about the focus of this podcast and some of the guests that we've had on the podcast. So we're going to continue to do even more. So my idea is to, every 10 to 20 episodes, say, or whenever it seems like it would be a good time to do it, I'll drop a best of episode. And the purpose would be to give our listeners a chance to look back at some of the best podcasts we've done. I'm not sure if this is something that everyone does, but I tend to listen to episodes of some of my favorite podcasts multiple times. And I often wish that some of my favorite podcast hosts would do a best of episode. It gives you a chance to get a snapshot of podcasts you may have listened to, but maybe you'll get a new perspective on some of the important points. You may have been distracted listening on some points. So sometimes you just get a better perspective when you hear something the second time. Or there may be new facts and circumstances on a topic that might call for some updated commentary. So this was my idea, and so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick 5 of the last 10 podcasts, which is going to be very hard because all 10 had some unbelievable guests since we've started. But I'll pick 5, and then I'll play a short clip from each one. And then post-clip, I'll come on afterwards to offer some new commentary or perspective on that clip. So, without further delay, let's start with the first best of the Endurance Experience. So the first clip is with Dr. Maria de Boef Miara on the issue of DSD athletes and trans athletes in sport. She's a PhD in biology and director of the Human Performance Lab at Brandeis University. So let me play the clip, and then post-clip, I'll return to discuss.
So when we are looking, and this is a case in running, so in short and middle distance running, and it also extends into longer distances as well. But in lots of sports, right? Most sports are separated into men and women. We do see in the running, we see a big difference in the performances. 10-15% depending on the event that we're talking about.
Right.
And that difference is large enough that if we put everybody in the same grouping, then the women would never really be able to place, or
Right.
would be so far behind that it, it would make no sense for them to compete, right?
Exactly.
And so that, I mean, and we look at this as men and women as two separate classes, but I would also remind people that there are other sports that use other things as well as that. So, there's plenty of sports that have weight classes because they recognize that being of a certain size, regardless of whether you're male or female, has an advantage. And so it's not, men and women is the most ubiquitous difference that we use for lots of sports. There's other sports that use other things as well.
Right, and that's a good example. And boxing, mixed martial arts have weight classes, and another great example is the Paralympics. Right, so Paralympics has something like 70 classes, right, for challenged athletes. So someone might have, cerebral palsy. There are different impairments based upon the classes, right? So there are people that have, strength issues. There are people that have, difficulty, running uphill, things like that. So there are different classifications of impairments in Paralympics, and so there's the same exact thing. There are rules set up and governing bodies set up so that they can create those classifications and enforce them. So the frequent argument that we've been seeing in the public sphere is Michael Phelps, where people are saying, well, how come they don't regulate Michael Phelps because he has super flexible feet and he has long arms and he has low lactic acid buildup. And to me, this is just really an invalid argument, right? Because we don't have protective classes for swimmers with short arms or non-flexible feet or short swimmers. So that to me is clearly a flawed argument. But we have protective classes for male, female, for boxers and MMA fighters, for physically challenged athletes. And so if there are governing bodies that have those protected classes, we have to, or they have to, enforce those classes. They have to, all right? So that's one of the arguments that's out in the public sphere that I continue to see that is to me not a valid argument. So with I don't know if do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say if we were to see, like, hypothetically, if we were to look at our swimmers and see that they, there were two sort of big groups of swimmers, right? The swimmers with long arms, say, and the swimmers with short arms, then you could imagine that it would make sense for the governing bodies to decide that we should have these two classes for
right.
different types of swimmers. It's much more of a continuous trait, and also I think we've recognized that individuals like Michael Phelps that have these particular suite of characteristics are somewhat unique. And so if we were to create those kinds of classes, well, then there'd be Michael Phelps, and then
right.
and maybe a few people, and then everyone else. And so it's not sort of a meaningful competition at that point. And that's something that the IAAF keeps referring to they're trying to ensure fair and meaningful competition, which is an extremely high bar to reach. I think that's the challenge, right? Is that you have to decide what that means. Right,
exactly. And we don't have the short NBA, right? So any NBA player that's below 6 feet tall, but if they ever did, create such a league, someone would have to create rules, and then governing bodies would enforce them. So I think you're right on target with that. I'm not sure if other podcasters do this, but I sometimes cringe listening to my old recordings. This being my second podcast and still being pretty inexperienced at this. I'm hoping I have figured out how to stop breathing into the microphone. So this actually was the reason I launched the podcast earlier than expected. I initially wanted to launch the podcast this summer or late summer, and when this issue took off like a rocket in early spring, I knew I had to launch the podcast in the spring because this is exactly the type of issue that I wanted to have conversations about. Objective, unbiased conversations. And I still believe that this is the most important and complex issue in sports, intersecting science, sports, and culture. And it will continue to be going into the next couple of years. But this clip, I think, represents a good encapsulation of both issues with intersex athletes or athletes with DSD, disorder of sexual development, and also trans athletes. So if you imagine an efficient frontier where on one axis is fairness in sport and on the other axis is inclusivity in sport, we're trying to find this theoretical efficient frontier. We're not on it now, it seems. And sport policy is trying to find out how we get closer to or get on that efficient frontier. The point in the clip about classification is how we determine fairness today in sport. And this is based upon 100 years, the end product of 100 years of sport. This is how we determine fairness. There's the primary classification of biological sex. And then, stemming from that, there's several subclassifications. There are impairments, as I mentioned in the clip. There are impairments for physically challenged athletes, Paralympians, wheelchair marathoners, etc. Then there's the subclassification of weight for combat sports and perhaps some weightlifting federations. And, that's pretty much it for elite athletes. Then there are age group classifications for non-elites, and then there's for cycling we have what's called CATs, Cat 1, Cat 2, all the way up to Cat 5, and then this is basically classifications of cycling experience. And so that's basically it. There are a handful of classifications, and classifications are how we draw the lines of fairness in sport. Biological sex, impairments, weight, in some non-elite, age, and CATs for cycling. That's it. That's how we draw lines of fairness. That's why this common argument about Michael Phelps that we talked about in the clip, i.e., why don't they regulate Michael Phelps? Because his arms are so long and his feet are so floppy. He's a genetic freak and everything like that. First thing we know that he's not a genetic freak. That argument has never been able to stand up against scientific scrutiny, first of all. His characteristics are probably inside the normal distribution of a swimmer, but nevertheless, we define fairness in sport based upon those classifications that I just described and what we talked about in the clip. Biological sex as primary, and then impairments as subclassification, weight as subclassification, and then for non-elites there's age and CATs and cycling for subclassification. And so that's based upon the end product of 100 years of sport to get to those classifications, and that's how we draw the line in fairness. We don't look at how tall somebody is, how long somebody's arms are. We don't have classifications for those intricate details. That would be an intractable problem. So when those arguments like that are made, it just really exposes the individual, because it demonstrates that they perhaps have not gone deeper to really unpack this problem. And it also ignores women outliers, people like Daniela Reef, for instance, the women's Ironman champion for several years. she's without a doubt an outlier, destroying her competition. Daniela Reef will cross the finish line in some 70.3s, and then the second place finisher will come a half an hour later. The same thing with Katie Ledecky. She is absolutely destroying her competition internationally, and her competitors are trying to figure out what to do with her. She may end up being more decorated than Michael Phelps in the end. Nevertheless, it remains that we have a protected class in the female classification of sport, and it's highly unlikely that that's going to change. So we have to find a better way to increase inclusivity for these athletes, DSD athletes, and also trans athletes, without at the same time compromising fairness. And I don't know if there's going to be rules that will come about before Tokyo Olympics, but people are calling for the IOC, the IAAF, to step forward with more leadership and more uniform and consistent rules in this area. And this goes deep. I mean, even with high school, there was a recent lawsuit with high school, and the rules in high school are much more relaxed than NCAA and IAAF and IOC. But we will, I think, see some policy changes. It just remains to be seen when. What form those policy changes will take is unclear. Whether or not they will address both fairness and inclusivity is anybody's guess. The Caster Semenya Swiss court appeal, that is still pending. We know that this summer the judge barred Caster Semenya from competing this fall, and so people were perceiving that as a signal of how that's going to go. She made a statement, said that she is going to now play soccer. So that's where that stands. But I want to have a follow-up podcast on this topic as soon as we have more information. I don't want to do it too soon. I'd rather do it when we have more information. And I have some ideas of the guests I want to have for a follow-up. There's a couple pending scientific studies that will influence policy. One out of the UK, another one out in Sweden. They just released some preliminary research out of the Karolinska Institute, and there's another one out in South Africa. I will put the link to the Karolinska study in the show notes, and I highly recommend taking a look at that. It's on trans athletes, and I highly recommend going back and listening to that podcast with Dr. Maria de Boef Miara, or if you haven't listened to it yet, just go check it out. So let's move on to the next clip in this episode of the Best of the Endurance Experience podcast. The next clip is from a podcast that I had with Dr. Stephan Guyenet. He is the author of the book The Hungry Brain, and he is one of the world's leading researchers on obesity and the obesity epidemic. So we had a conversation about that. He has a PhD in neuroscience, and he has a broad research agenda on this topic. So without further delay, here's Dr. Stephan Guyenet.
So you're asking what are the health impacts of obesity?
Right.
Yeah. So this continues to be debated, just how harmful it is. I mean, I think pretty much everyone agrees that it's not good for you. But the degree of harm is continuing to be debated. However, I believe that it is quite harmful. There are a couple of different lines of evidence that we can look at. So the one I think that's most visible when we start thinking about this question are observational studies that have just measured people's body mass index, which is just their weight corrected for height. And then they say, hey, so, we measured 10,000 people's body mass index. Let's see who gets sick and who doesn't, and we'll correlate that with baseline body mass index. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, and you just kind of do it in a really simple way, you see that there's not a really strong correlation between body mass index and health outcomes. However, and they call this the obesity paradox, the fact that, we have all of this research from basic science in animal models and randomized controlled trials with, short-term outcomes suggesting that it's really not good for you to have excess fat. But then in these big long-term observational studies, we're not really seeing that as much. And the reason, I think, a major reason for that is that these studies may suffer from pretty serious confounding. Mm-hmm. So particularly something called reverse causality, where basically instead of, it's not just obesity making people sick, it's sick people losing weight. And so making being lean look less healthy than it should, because if you have cancer, if you have Alzheimer's disease, if you have diabetes, if you have certain types of cardiovascular disease, many of those actually cause weight loss. And so what you might be seeing is that people who are sick, the relationship is confounded because people who are sick weigh less than they otherwise would if they weren't sick. So it makes being lean look more dangerous than it should. And so when you correct for that, there are a couple different ways to do it that I'll just gloss over for now unless you want to talk about them. When you correct for that, basically obesity starts to look a lot more harmful. So essentially, the more fat you carry on your body, the higher your risk of having a heart attack, the higher your risk of having cancer, higher the risk of having stroke, higher risk of having arthritis is a common one. Right. And the strongest relationship of all is with type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes is exquisitely sensitive to body fatness and calorie intake, in calorie in and out, basically what we call energy balance, the relationship between calories coming in and calories going out and your body fatness. Type 2 diabetes is exquisitely sensitive to that. And so if you reduce someone's calorie intake or increase their physical activity level and you cause them to lose weight a little bit, it doesn't even have to be that much. There are a number of really very high quality, long-term randomized controlled trials with actual real diabetes outcomes that show that substantial, all those things I just mentioned, substantially reduce the risk of progressing to type 2 diabetes. So just to put that another way, we have really, really solid evidence that you can actually prevent type 2 diabetes by reducing calorie intake or increasing expenditure via diet or physical activity. Right. And furthermore, you can actually reverse established type 2 diabetes. This was shown in a trial called the Direct trial. It took people with mild type 2 diabetes and showed basically if you put them on a very low calorie diet, 46% of people by the end of a year, so a temporary low calorie diet for a few months, then maintenance out to a year, 46% of them didn't have diabetes anymore. They were off their medications, their blood glucose was controlled, they were able to eat carbohydrate normally without insulin or anything. And so this shows that, developing diabetes and the maintenance of the diabetic state are exquisitely sensitive to calorie intake. And so, so I just wanted to mention that diabetes is the disease that is most tightly linked to body fatness and energy balance. And that's been shown over and over and over again. And one of the main mechanisms that connects body fatness to these chronic diseases is insulin resistance. So insulin resistance is the primary metabolic factor that underlies type 2 diabetes, and it is also exquisitely sensitive to energy balance and body fatness. And just to make sure everyone is on board with what I'm talking about, insulin resistance insulin is this really important hormone that regulates your blood glucose and your blood fat levels. and kind of is I like to call it a metabolic traffic cop in the body that kind of directs the traffic of different metabolic fuels. And if that's screwed up, if your tissues can't hear insulin very well, if it requires more insulin to get the same metabolic job done, then we call that insulin resistance. And that's kind of what happens to the typical person who's eating the typical diet and not being physically active. Once that person ages somewhat, they're likely going to be insulin resistant. And one of the main causes of that is positive energy balance and excess body fatness. So insulin resistance is exquisitely sensitive to those, and then insulin resistance goes on to cause these other things like diabetes, and probably contributes to cancer risk, and almost certainly contributes to cardiovascular disease risk. And so I think that's a major pathway by which body fatness and calorie intake impacts disease risk.
This is another science-fueled topic that invites passionate debate and discussion. And while it might seem axiomatic that there are adverse consequences for prolonged clinical obesity, you'd be very surprised at how many people try to debate these facts. This is the reason why I chose that particular clip. We have a great deal of empirical evidence and epidemiological study behind what Dr. Guyenet is explaining in this clip regarding the health consequences from clinical obesity. And yes, what we put in food in modern times is a factor. The general increased availability of said food in modern times is a factor. Issues that disproportionately impact economically disadvantaged communities is a factor. I see this in my own community of Black Americans. We have higher percentages of obesity than the general population. There's genetic influences that play a role. And so it is multifactorial, but where the rubber meets the road, today we are consuming more and moving less. Full stop. For evidence of this, all one would need do is look at median body composition in humans even 50, 60 years ago, let alone 100 years or hundreds of years ago, and compare that with humans of today, and you look at the difference of humans, and difference in humans, and then you'll see that obviously our body composition profile is more negative today in humans wielding the same genes, effectively the same genes. So that demonstrates that behavioral differences in people today are a gigantic factor in why we're seeing an epidemic. At the same time, I submit, being somewhat of an energy balance hawk, and I've always said, look, negative energy balance, expend more, consume less. And while that is scientifically sound, when you understand thermodynamics, there's no other known way that body fat moves out of a body than that. Yet, still, after reading The Hungry Brain, I budged a little in my understanding of how the brain impacts human behavior, influences human behavior in order to defend a body fat set point. And so that greatly enhanced my knowledge of that side of it. So I highly recommend the book, The Hungry Brain. I think it's the best book out there on this topic that dives into the specific science. And I highly recommend listening to my podcast with Dr. Stephan Guyenet. All right, moving on to the next clip in this episode of the Best of the Endurance Experience podcast. This clip is from my conversation with Katherine Switzer. She is the first woman to officially register and run the Boston Marathon with a bib, even though they tried to pull her off the course that day that she made that attempt. And so I have a great conversation about her, about that day, and her book, Marathon Woman. So here is my clip from my conversation with Katherine Switzer. So April 19th, 1967. So you meet Coach Briggs, you train diligently, and you get to the Boston Marathon, and you everything's seemingly fine, and you start. Then so describe to our listeners what happens after that.
Well, what happened after that? First of all, the guys were all welcoming and wonderful, but it was very, very bad weather. And so we were all bundled up in everything we owned, in my case, a very baggy, ugly gray sweatsuit. And from a distance, we all looked alike. We looked like a bunch of refugees trotting down the street to Boston. And a mile into the race, the press truck passed us. The press truck was behind the field, and they worked their way through up to the front. And when they got up midway, and there I was in the race running with my teammates from Syracuse University, they went kind of crazy, saying, "Oh my God, there's a woman in the race, and she's wearing a bib number." And they started taking pictures. And for a while, this was funny. It was kind of like, waving to our mother on the nightly news, when another bus stopped behind the press truck, and on that were the officials, the race officials. And one of them was the race director. He jumped off the bus and went after me, and I didn't hear him because I was looking ahead. And I didn't hear him behind me with all this commotion going on. And suddenly he just grabbed me and he threw me back and screamed at me to get the hell out of his race and give me those numbers. And he proceeded to try to rip the numbers off of my chest. And I jumped away from him, and he went for the numbers on the back, my back. And my coach, Arnie, who we've been talking about, started screaming at him, "Leave her alone. She's okay. I've trained her." Because he immediately knew that this guy was thinking I was just some kind of clown or somebody in his race. And he smacked him out of the way and kept coming after me. And my boyfriend, who was running with me, who happened to be a 235-pound ex-All-American football player,
right,
threw a cross-body block into this race director and sent him flying. Well, of course, it was actually funny. I heard you laugh. It's funny in the retelling. And at the moment, though, I mean, really, it was a terrible thing, a terrible incident. And I was absolutely terrified. And we were all scared, except for my boyfriend, who was so steaming mad he could have murdered this guy. And the press, of course, were right in front of us with the press truck and captured this whole incident on film.
Right.
And we didn't pay attention to that. I was just trying to get out of there. And Arnie said, "Run like hell," and down the street we went. And we were really, just trying to get away from the whole scene. The press truck stayed with us for a long time. We were very aggressive. And then even the bus came by, and the official had gotten back on the bus. So I was happy to see that. I thought we had murdered him. And he shouted and cursed at us and told us we were in big trouble. And then went on up to apparently the start of the race. What he had done, totally unbeknownst to me, was to tell the police to pull me out of the race when I came along. And also went to the finish and had me disqualified from the race, and wrote a cable to the Amateur Athletic Union to have me expelled from the Athletic Federation, which is really a horrible thing. But at any rate, I didn't know all this. I was just trying to finish.
Right.
But the important part of this story is that at that moment, after the official finally left us, and the press truck finally left us, I said to my coach, Arnie, that I said, "I'm finishing this race on my hands and my knees if I have to. Mm-hmm. Because if I don't finish this race, nobody's going to believe women can do it." And I often look back on that moment because it was probably the most important decision of my life. And, there are two things that can happen to you when you have a crisis. You can walk away from it or run away from it, or you can pick it up, decide you're going to finish the job, and take responsibility for it. And I did that because I knew if I quit, nobody would believe women could do it. And of course I wanted to quit for a few minutes. I wanted to go home to my mother. I was so ashamed and scared and embarrassed. But all the guys were really wonderful to me, very motivating in the race. They were very nice and protective even. And I also had trained for it. I said, well, what am I going to do? Go home?
Right.
So I decided to no matter what, finish.
Yeah.
And it was the best decision ever, because a marathon's very long. You can't run that distance and stay mad. And I really resolved through the race what had happened, and that was that the official was just a product of his time. He was an ignorant man, but it was up to me to start changing those kinds of attitudes, and the best way to do it is to finish the job here. Run it, finish it. Right. And also, I knew that other women, at first I was angry at them, like I was at Syracuse University. I said, where are you guys? Why aren't you participating in sports? Why don't you get out there and do it? Well, you can only do what you can imagine, and they couldn't even imagine doing sports. So how many women would ever imagine doing a marathon? So of course they weren't there. They were afraid. They had believed all those old myths that they were going to get big legs and turn into men if they ran a marathon. So they weren't going to be there. But if they could only know, I thought, is to feel as good as I feel. And I thought, well, okay, I'm going to change this. I'm going to create something where they can participate. Right. And give them the opportunity.
Right.
Now, and so when I finished the race, I had effectively a life plan.
Yeah. And it was an iconic moment, and when it was happening, it probably didn't register to you at all. But down to the Harry Trask photos, the famous photos that everybody knows, those photos couldn't have been any better. And after the event happened, in your book, you say you guys ran like kids out of a haunted house. I can almost picture it happening. And it's absolutely right. And that you're right about Harry Trask is interesting. He actually jumped off. This is the photographer, one of the many photographers who were there. There's some very good photographers since. I've seen their captions, but none better than Harry, who also was in an adverse situation. And we laughed about this. Over time, we became good friends. He went to the press room that morning to get a camera to cover the Boston Marathon, and all of the motor drive cameras had been taken by photographers heading out to Fenway. Mm-hmm. And of course, the game at Fenway was eventually canceled anyway because the weather was so brutal, cold, mm-hmm. It was miserable. But he only got a crank camera, 35 millimeter crank camera. So he gets on the back of the truck and he's annoyed. And then this incident happens and he saw it just beginning to brew. And he took the risk and jumped off the press truck so he could move in close to me. I didn't see him there. He was off to the side. Right. But he cranked off 3 pictures really fast, missed the press truck, decided it was worth the risk, got a taxi into Boston, went into the darkroom, developed 3 incredible photos that hit the wires before anybody else's did, and they went around the world. Right. And now they're one of Time Life's 100 photos that changed the world. Yes.
Isn't that amazing?
That is amazing. What a great conversation with Katherine Switzer, and that was a highlight for me to be able to discuss that day in 1967 with Katherine herself. She is a living legend, and if you read her book, The Marathon Woman, you really understand that. She was, after the event, she became an international media correspondent, right? And so she became an interviewer of great sports icons and such. And so she herself is a legend in that respect. So for me to be on the other side of it, interviewing her, that was a great experience. If you follow her on Twitter and her other social media, she goes by KV Switzer on Twitter, you'll see that she's still doing a lot for women's running, moving women's running forward with her 261 Fearless Foundation she founded, and she's also helping in many other ways. So on the podcast, I talked about trying to drum up support for a Katherine Switzer statue in Boston. That would be amazing. We have several statues in Boston for male icons who ran the Boston Marathon, but none for women. So I started looking into this and connecting with people about it. I did find out there's some initiatives that are currently in place for for the same thing for Bobby Gibb. Bobby Gibb, if you listen to the podcast, you'll know that she was the first woman to unofficially run the Boston Marathon. She hid in the bushes at the start and then jumped out and then ran and finished. And then Katherine Switzer talks about how Bobby Gibb was an influence. So I'm happy to see that that's happening. And if we saw both of them get a statue, that would be amazing. So for me, I think Katherine's influence was particularly monumental because, they actually tried to pull her off of the course. And when Jacques Semple, the race director, tried to do that, and she resisted, and her coach Arnie said, "Run like hell," and they continued to run. And so she officially registered her dissent with the system, and that set off the spark for the movement. And if you think about it, that was really her Rosa Parks moment, which I talk about. So when Rosa Parks sat in the front of the bus, there were black people that sat in the front of the bus. That happened, and Rosa Parks, the only reason that they pressed her to move that day was because the bus got crowded. If you do the research on that event, people would often, who weren't supposed to sit in the front of the bus, would do it and get away with it. But it was when the bus got full and they had to now ask her to move, and when she registered her dissent and said, "No, I'm not moving," that was the catalyst there. And so in the same way, when, even though Bobby Gibb had run and finished, they sort of just looked the other way at it, probably. But when Katherine, did it, and they tried to remove her, and she obviously did not comply, then that was the catalyst for that, and the Harry Trask photos and everything helped it along and everything like that. So we'll see what happens with the initiatives for the statue. I'll keep trying to drum up support and see how far I get. So I will ask that you go check out that podcast with myself and Katherine Switzer. So let's move to the next clip. The next clip is going to be from my conversation with Dr. Jill Harris and Dr. Nola Agha. They are two economists, and I had a conversation with them about the wage gap in professional sports. Here is the next clip on the Best of the Endurance Experience podcast.
This question on the issue of the U.S. women's national team certainly has these kind of microeconomic underpinnings. But I also think that it's a social issue, and that they clearly have used the recourses available in our society to make a claim that they're not being treated according to kind of fairness and equity principles that are present in our legal system. So, and that's broader than any microeconomic theory or model. That is an issue that is kind of ubiquitous across sport and other industries. So if I had to, I don't know what percentage I would give, how much is this a social issue versus a purely economic issue, but I'm convinced that it's both.
Interesting.
I mean, I certainly agree. If you look at just the general workplace, we know that women are paid less than men across virtually all industries and all segments of society. So based on that alone, we can say that there are a lot of social factors at play here that affect the average worker. We also know that there's a much larger pay disparity in sport than there is in general society, and whether that's we're looking at payouts in golf, whether we're looking at wages in basketball, that the disparities in sport are much larger than the 70 or 80 cents a dollar that the average female works. And so the other layer that goes on top of this is also that we're dealing with a nonprofit organization. So the U.S. Soccer Federation is technically a nonprofit, but it has a very unique mission to increase participation, spectator appeal, and to make soccer sort of the preeminent sport in America. And that's a very unique mission that they have. And that mission is supposed to be soccer as a whole. It's not supposed to be gender specific. So I think that's important social context to lay on top of this discussion as we go through.
I see. Okay. So they win the U.S. women's national team wins the World Cup, and then we get news of the lawsuit that was filed, a class action lawsuit. And just to set the tempo for the class action lawsuit, so they make just to give a little bit of numbers here. They say under the pay structure that went into effect through December 2008, men's national team players received a minimum, currently about $5,000, to play each game regardless of the outcome, win or lose. And so the minimum can increase to amounts currently ranging from $6,250 to $17,625, depending upon the level of their opponent and whether they win or tie a game. And so just to put that into perspective, they're saying that the pay for women is approximately 38% of the compensation of a similarly situated men's national team player. So about 38% less. So just to underscore what you were saying about the wage gap being bigger than the actual wage gap in the world with general people. So let's talk about the class action lawsuit. What do you know about it, and can you give some background on whether or not lawsuits like this have any impact in professional sports?
Yeah. So two things I think that anybody who wants to participate in this conversation should kind of have in their minds is that while it's straightforward to say that the women are making less, when you look at the claims and the responses so far in the lawsuit, you can't really get into the detail of the claims and the responses without understanding that, and you alluded to this, that the collective bargaining agreements that the men and women have are themselves different. So as Nola alluded to earlier, there's layers here. There's lots of layers. But I think in its essence, what this lawsuit is trying to get to is that in effect, the women, given their collective bargaining agreement, the women have to, in a sense, outperform the men in order to earn what you described, Tony, as this 38% less. They have to outperform the men. In fact, the men earn more for a loss than the women earn for a win, and that this is the inequity, regardless of how the dollars and cents are distributed. This is the inequity that they're trying to address. So the second part of your question, do lawsuits like this, are they effective? Without citing chapter and verse of some of the cases that our colleagues have written about, they have been effective, but it typically is more of a long run game. It's clearly not the shortest route to equal pay, or pay that reflects the value of these players. But there's precedent for these types of actions in the past, and I think that's why the women, leveraging their victory, leveraging the fact that they have been outperforming the men recently spectacularly,
Right.
They're capturing kind of the public imagination, and they're using their victories and their performance as leverage, even though they have a new collective bargaining agreement that is an improvement over their former one. They haven't closed the gap completely, and that's the issue that they're taking to the Federation via the courts.
Right.
So maybe it's something else to add here is to consider that the lawsuit was not just about pay, it was also about unequal playing conditions.
Right.
And claims that the women's team were given fewer resources in order to promote the game, in order to market the game. When the games were put on, there was, for example, lower ticket prices, which then in effect reduces the ultimate revenues of the organization when it looks like it's coming from the women's side. So that as we think about, and as the conversation moves towards more specifics on the actual components of the wages and what women are being paid, that those in some ways are a function of the way the organization is structured and the decisions that it makes in order to try and monetize the women's events. The recent Women's World Cup is a really good example of that. I was not there in person, but I saw plenty of reports on social media that there was very few items to buy, merchandise, if you wanted a t-shirt or a keychain, that there was very little to buy.
Right.
That there was a poor attempt by FIFA to even maximize their revenue from a merchandise standpoint for the women's game.
Right after the podcast went live, news broke that the arbitration talks that were going on to attempt to settle the lawsuit broke down. So this podcast came at the right time, and during that time, it was one of the most downloaded and played podcasts, and today it's still one of the most listened to out of all of the podcasts. So thanks to Dr. Agha and Dr. Harris, they sent me in a new direction with our conversation. I honestly hadn't formulated a solid position on the topic. But since then, I feel as if I have a better grasp of the problem at minimum. You know, on the one hand, differences in the collective bargaining agreements appear to be a big factor in the disparity. And certainly there are complex structural issues embedded in there, as well as economic issues embedded in there that result in those differences. So on the other hand, there's differences in revenue streams at the FIFA level, and that's an entirely different issue to contend with. But pay aside, the women's national team lawsuit names a myriad of grievances in the lawsuit that at minimum need to be addressed. Unequal treatment and unequal playing conditions and such. Some of them at least sound like they can be immediately addressed. So no matter what, people think that they have this issue 100% figured out. And I would say they are surely mistaken, as this issue has many moving parts. And, so I highly recommend listening to this podcast. It will certainly provide you with some more information on this topic. And I'd love to talk to Dr. Agha and Dr. Harris again. I can think of other topics that we can dive into in the future. Okay, so let's get to the final clip in this best of episode of the Endurance Experience. My final clip is going to be the conversation that I had with Dr. Oscar Jeukendrup, another distinguished PhD. He literally wrote the book on endurance nutrition and fueling for endurance sports. and we have a great conversation about this topic. So here is a clip from my conversation with Dr. Oscar Jeukendrup. Since I would say the last decades, I mean, we always hear about these diets, these fad diets that come along. It seems like a new one comes along every other year. Everything from South Beach to Paleo to Atkins. Now it's like ketogenic, which is like if Atkins and Paleo had a baby, it'd be ketogenic. And then there's all of these. Now I've looked at these diets, and from time to time I try to figure out whether or not there's research or efficacy, and I haven't really found that these diets do anything but really manipulate energy balance in a different way. So I wanted to get your ideas on that. Where do you see that as I do, that these diets, all of them, are just unique ways of manipulating energy balance?
Yeah, I think you're pretty you're spot on there. I think all of these diets. Let's start with this. All of these diets can actually work to lose weight. Any diet can work, because as soon as you start a diet, you're really paying attention to your diet. You're paying attention to what you eat, and you will lose weight. And this is also, you can find this in the literature. So you can find evidence that like a low fat diet can reduce weight. A low carbohydrate diet can reduce weight. There are really extreme ways to do it, and you will lose weight. The less extreme ways to do it, and you'll lose weight. You reduce carbohydrate and fat intake, you also lose weight. So yes, it is really about making sure that you are in negative energy balance, and you do that by paying attention to what you eat.
Right.
And of course, it is possible that some people find it easier to reduce their intake on a certain diet. So that is possible. Or they like foods that fit into the category of a certain diet, and the diet sort of gives structure to their thinking. So it is possible, but I think an important message is that there really is nothing magical about these diets.
Right.
It is really about eating less and moving more.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And I mean, and that's very important. It's a very important message, especially with athletes, endurance athletes, who are always seeking for the silver bullet. Like there's a silver bullet way of doing something, and it's just moving more, eating less. So let's talk about that now. When you're working with endurance athletes, and obviously you're working with a lot of elite of the elite athletes, and many of us coaches will work with people on the range of recreational. Maybe sometimes you might come across an elite athlete. So if you're working with elite athletes and some people on the recreational side, you're just sort of trying to point them in the direction of slightly better health and fitness. But what's your general philosophy on just general nutrition, and what's the approach that you look to convey to athletes as they're trying to maximize power to weight ratio? Maybe it's to progress towards a better competition body for a recreational athlete or an elite athlete.
I think my approach would be like a no-nonsense approach, no magic approach, and real foods approach. And always taking into account what is important for that particular person, for that particular athlete. If you work with an elite athlete, it is about seconds sometimes. Sometimes it's about fractions of seconds. Every little bit of improvement can help Is that really important for the age grouper whose main goal is to get to the finish line? So I would say no. Mm-hmm. So for that person, it's much more important that they can have fun on their day, that they have no gastrointestinal problems, and they feel great throughout the race.
Right.
It's not about sort of pushing to get the last bit of energy out of the body. And so it's understanding what is the goal of that athlete, and what are we really trying to achieve, and then you develop a strategy that matches that. And it's also when you're looking for the foods that will help the person achieve those goals, try to look for real foods when possible.
Right.
Sometimes it's actually challenging with real foods to do the things that we want to do, and that's where like sports nutrition products can be really useful.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I think in a lot of cases you can just solve it with normal regular foods.
Yeah.
So yeah, this I think the really important part is to understand what exactly are the goals. And to go back a little bit in our conversation, I think a lot of the confusion that we have in nutrition is that people generalize, and so we have certain diets that are aimed at people who are trying to lose weight, but those are people maybe that do not exercise at all.
Right.
And then we take that particular diet and we take the things that we want to hear about that diet and apply it in an exercise setting where we are training 2-3 hours a day. And it may be totally inappropriate because you use a lot more fuel, you use very different fuels, and therefore the diet has to be drastically different. So a lot of the confusion is because we don't take into account why we're doing these diets.
Right.
So
yeah, and I echo the sentiments. Real foods that humans have relied on for hundreds of thousands of years. Fruits, vegetables, lean meats. Legumes, right? And there's nothing fatty about that, or it's just you're focusing on simple, healthy foods, and trying to, if insofar as you're trying to get a little healthier on the recreational side, it makes sense to making sure that you're in caloric deficit when you need it. Yeah, and that's it. It's simple, right?
Yeah. So this simple, but people want it even simpler. They want to divide foods into two categories. One is good, and the other category is bad.
Right.
And a lot of the diet books are written that way, and it usually villainizes a certain food or a certain nutrient. And that's what you have to avoid in the diet. Right. And that's the whole diet is about that. But it's not about avoiding things. It is about having certain things maybe in moderation and other things a little bit more on certain days when you need it.
Right.
But it's a lot of it is common sense, but it is not black and white.
Right. The podcast with Dr. Oscar Jeukendrup is one of our most downloaded and played podcasts. If you're an endurance athlete and you're at all interested in nutrition and fueling, as I know most of us are, I highly recommend listening to that podcast if you haven't already done so, or even if you have, go back and listen to it again. It really touches on some very important concepts. And for years, I've been speaking out about the so-called silver bullets that exist in nutrition and fueling discussions with athletes. Everybody now has a silver bullet, a fad diet. And all of these diets, as you heard in the clip, are just intricate ways of manipulating the energy balance equation. Some of them are more extreme than others, but there's no evidence that they do anything at all but manipulate energy balance. So the fueling question is really one we get into later, and then this just gets into best practices with fueling for endurance events, and of course there are new extraordinary claims in the fueling world, things like so-called super starches, and the idea that natural, quote-unquote, natural fuel sources are ipso facto better than, something that you can buy in the store. But I think at one point in time, Professor Jeukendrup said, look, your stomach is not going to know the difference, which is what I've been saying for years with folks. So I highly recommend, if you're an endurance athlete, go back and listen to that. Okay, so we've come to the end of the best of episode, the first best of episode, and we're going to have some more of these as we increase our podcastography. And I want to invite comments on our podcast. We have a website add-on called Discuss for comments, and if you'd like to give your 2 cents on any of the podcasts, there are ways you can do it. So if you go to eventhorizon.tv/podcast, you'll see the Discuss add-on at the bottom where you can comment generally across the podcast, or you can go to eventhorizon.tv/blog to comment on an individual episode. As you've heard in these clips in this episode of the Best of the Endurance Experience podcast, there's an incredible diversity in topic, which is exactly what I was going for. And I didn't want to do the typical how-to podcast, and I wanted to tackle everything that falls on the intersection of endurance sport, traditional sport, health, fitness, life, and culture, and science, right? So that's exactly what we've done, and we struck a chord that is proven in the global listener base that we've garnered. And so I'll continue to do this, and when you see some of the guests that we have lined up for the late fall and the winter, you'll see that we're going to do a lot of the same thing, just continue to unbiased and objectively come to a conclusion, or at least unpack the issues related to some of these topics, and always coming back to what does the science say. So if you think you like the podcast and you want to continue to be a supporter, you can always check us out at patreon.com/endurance if you like what we do. This is the Endurance Experience Podcast.
Follow Event Horizon Endurance Sport on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter for training programs and services. To become a member of our Endurance Institute or for a complete archive of podcasts, log on to our website, eventhorizon.tv.